Before we start this conversation, Mr. Leon, it bears repeating the statements from the FW De Klerk Foundation that says, basically reports that his health is rapidly deteriorating are not true, basically saying that there is no discernible deterioration in his health since he was diagnosed in March, and saying that he actually attended a meeting of the FW De Klerk Foundation board yesterday. So just putting that on the record. But Mr. Leon, part of the reason we are talking to you is that, in as far as FW De Klerk is concerned, when you hear reports that he is unwell, it naturally triggers a polarizing conversation in society. That always happens, no doubt. There'll be those who'll be reflecting on his role in reading the writing that was on the wall towards the end of apartheid, that apartheid had to be wound down, but there will be those who'll be reflecting on his legacy in a more negative light in as far as the transition period is concerned, the political violence that happened, and also recently the comments for which you slammed him, and the comments around, apartheid not having been a crime against humanity, which comments, of course, he eventually withdrew and apologized for. How does South Africa deal with such a complex legacy?
Well, I think you're quite right. It is a complex legacy, and you look at the complexity. But there are certain incontestable facts and objective truths, I think, related to FW De Klerk, and I certainly hope that he recovers from his current hospitalisation and illness. Well, let me say, first of all, that, and I see this in De Klerk's presence, so I'm not speaking in any way behind his back, I think De Klerk suffers from what you might call the Gorbachev complex. And I reference that to Mikhail Gorbachev, who was also the last leader of his ideology, or his era in the Soviet Union, and ushered in a host of reforms which transformed modern-day Russia, just as De Klerk's reforms in 1989 and 1990 transformed the South Africa we live in today. And I think the paradox is this, that on the one hand, De Klerk was the last National Party leader, but the first one to actually read the writing on the wall, as you said, but not to assume it was addressed to someone else, and to actually inaugurate the wholesale reforms the country desperately needed to embark on the road to democracy and multi-party democracy in our country. So that's the one part, but of course the people who were liberated as a consequence of those reforms, the majority of this country, do not feel, as most Russians do not feel, much affection for the person who came from the old regime in order to inaugurate the reforms which paved the way to the new one. And then, of course, the people who lifted De Klerk to the presidency, being white South Africans, he was the last white president to be so elected, feel in some ways they were shortchanged because a lot of the prospectus that De Klerk offered about safeguards against majority rule, the retention of property rights, mother tongue education, have not been retained into the future as he promised they would be. So in a way, he falls short on both counts in terms of both those constituencies. On the other hand, I think it's absolutely true, and the Nobel Prize Committee realized this in 1993, that for the incontestable leadership of Nelson Mandela, on the one hand, you needed a De Klerk on the other. And there are very, very few successful, relatively peaceful transitions to democracy anywhere in the world that have only happened in a one-sided manner. In other words, you needed someone from the old regime to recognize the writing on the wall, as De Klerk did, and someone from the incoming regime to have the largeness of spirit to accommodate all the diverse interests of his country, as Nelson Mandela certainly had. So I think it was the combination that actually helped South Africa birth a modern democracy in 1994.
So how important is it then, Mr. Leon, that when we're reflecting on FW De Klerk's life, we are honest to both sides of the coin, the good and the bad, I suppose, the good, the bad, and the ugly?
Well, I think that's the only way to actually look at any well-lived and consequential life. And FW De Klerk is 84 years old. He was a National Party cabinet minister for many years. He came from what you might call the royalty of the National Party. His uncle, J.G. Strydom, was the hardline apartheid prime minister of the 1950s. His father, was the secretary of the National Party in Transvaal. He was a royalty of the National Party, so that's part of his legacy. On the other hand, he was the first National Party politician with power to actually take South Africa from where it was to where it could be, and I think that should also be recognized. And of course, I think some of the recent controversies attaching to FW De Klerk are because he himself had some difficulty in marrying those two parts of his very long and well-lived political life. On the one hand, he perhaps, because he's a politician and a human being, wants remembered for the one big thing he got right between 1990 and 1994, and not for the many things that history judged, and I think correctly, that he got wrong before he became president in 1989. So, I've always believed that often in South Africa, we airbrush people's past, for better or for worse. There are many examples of this, of controversial, colourful politicians who've done good and bad things, and we only remember the one or we emphasise the other. And I think, a true reading of history requires that we be even-handed and objective.
Lastly, your own reflections on his political, facing him, right? Because my understanding is that you became an MP in the year of 1989 when FW De Klerk was making all of those pronouncements in that speech on February the 2nd. You had, of course, been active in politics for several years before then, but you became an MP in 89. Let me quote what you said when he pulled out of the Government of National Unity. You described that decision as being politically expedient, petulant, and a complete negation. That was you, I think it was 1996, but also you didn't shy away from calling him out on what I talked about at the start of this interview when he was saying that apartheid was not a crime against humanity, and subsequently he withdrew those comments through his foundation and apologized. How have you found FW De Klerk as a political competitor, opponent?
Well, he was very tough. He was a very good debater. That's the first thing. And secondly, he always used the elements of surprise. So, I was elected as MP for Houghton in 1989, the same election that saw him become president. And De Klerk had actually led the campaign against me in my constituency and campaigned for my National Party opponents at the local primary school, making all kinds of remarks about the Democratic Party as being basically a satrap of the ANC. And so it was very surprising at his first speech in Parliament on the 2nd of February that he basically embraced the very philosophy of the party he'd rubbished in that election, my party, the Democratic Party. But I say thank God for South Africa's future that he actually did that thing, which Van Zyl Slabbert, one of my predecessors as the leader of the opposition, said was a comprehensive sellout of everything the National Party had stood for since 1948. But at least he sold out that which was bad and embraced that which was good. So I was impressed with that. But the other thing is De Klerk was a very good tactician. So when the National Party was losing a lot of support to its far right wing in the Conservative Party, it lost a famous by-election in Potchefstroom in 1992, he then called a referendum of all white people whom he knew would be on his side rather than some isolated Conservative constituencies who weren't. So he had the tactics. He was a very good tactician. Whether he had the overall strategy to get beyond where he was to where he wanted to be, I think that was more questionable. And so, for example, the very quote that I used against him in 1996 when he pulled out of the Government of National Unity, I think that was a tactic rather than something joined to an overarching strategy. And he himself, in later life, I think regretted the fact that having had the opportunity to serve in government, however difficult it was, between 1994 and 1999, he left 3 years before he needed to or was required to. And I think that was to meet an immediate tactic of the problems in the National Party at the time, rather than an overall strategy of what was going to be in the nation's best interests. And again, FW was a bit ambivalent when the Democratic Alliance was formed between the National Party and the Democratic Party, because he embraced it, and then when his hand-selected leader, Martinus van Schalkwyk, pulled out, he denounced it, and then later affirmed it when the National Party joined the ANC. So but he's a human being. He is a politician. So some of his judgments are going to be wrong, especially if he has such a long political career as he's had or did have. But I think on the biggest issue facing this country, were we going to go into racial lagers, or were we going to embrace the prospects of a multi-party democracy and all-race election? I think he got the biggest issue that ever faced him correct, and that's to his credit.
All right, thank you for your insights there, Tony Leon, the former leader of the Democratic Alliance, talking there about the legacy of FW De Klerk. And again, we will emphasize that his foundation telling us that the reports that his health is rapidly deteriorating, that is not so, according to the FW De Klerk Foundation.